If you look at the genealogy in Genesis 4 to 6, you'll see that that because people lived such long lives then, 600, 700, 800 years, because of these long lifespan, Noah was the first person born since Adam's death. Okay? Meaning Noah's generation was the first generation born after Adam's death. Okay? So Adam saw his great, 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 great grandchildren for 9 generations. So there were 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and then after Noah, if you look at Genesis 10 to 11, you'll see another genealogy listing 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. So, so clearly we have a history of humanity here that details a symmetrical progression between these 3 men chosen by God. Okay? Adam, Noah, and Abraham. So God created Adam, gave him the earth, gave him a mission to prosper and multiply and fill the earth and rule it, and gave him certain rules to live by. Then God chose Noah, gave him the earth once again after the flood, gave him a mission to prosper and multiply and fill the earth and rule it, and formed a new relationship with him and his progeny, cemented by an alliance or covenant, manifested by this rainbow in the sky. And God gave Noah new rules as part of this new alliance or new relationship between God and humanity. And then God chooses Abraham. Okay? And God gives Abraham land. He gives him, again, a mission to prosper and multiply and fill the land, this land, and rule it. And he forms an even closer relationship with him and his progeny than the one with Noah and his progeny, cemented by this macabre alliance when God walks between those carcasses that Abraham separates. It's called the covenant of the pieces. It's in Genesis 15, chapter 15, verse 1 to 15. It's called, again, the covenant of the pieces, or in Hebrew, Brit Ben Hapatalim. Later on, God will give the Israelites and their progeny new rules, the 10 Commandments and the Torah, as part of this special alliance that God had established with Abraham. So, so you see how these genealogies are not just these boring list of names. These are meaningful things. There's a message delivered through these genealogies. So speaking of Abraham, next week our readings will be Genesis 11, verse 26, all the way through Genesis 24, verse 1. Okay, so we're reading a large chunk of text, about 12 chapters. And the reason to read this long text rather than just the stories we're going to discuss at one point, the individual stories that make up the Abraham story, just kind of reading it in progression. So the reason to do this has to do with the difficulty of the Abraham story in particular, specifically the binding of Isaac, the sacrifice of Isaac, but also because of a broader methodological observation about how one should read the Bible in general. Okay? There's a biblical scholar named Paul Borgman who observes, and he has a book called Genesis, the Story We Haven't Heard. And in the introduction, he talks about how he observes that when people read the story of Abraham, God comes off as arbitrary, inscrutable, and capricious, and cruel, and childish in his demand that Abraham sacrifice his son to him. Okay? And Abraham as well emerges as a bewildering figure. He's slavish and fanatical and And a lot of people see the Abraham character as monstrous in a way. So Borgman makes the case that the reason God seems this way to us and Abraham seems this way to us is because of the way we all read the Bible, fragment by fragment. You know, we read bits and pieces at a time rather than reading it as a unitary literary whole, as in sitting and reading a novel in one sitting. Okay, we read chapter and then another chapter and then separately. Okay, so in the Christian tradition, people are exposed to the Bible through sermons in which the minister or Sunday school teacher picks a biblical anecdote and uses it to make a point about life or society or God or culture. In the Jewish tradition, people read the Bible itself weekly, but again, one small bit every week. Okay, so over the course of the year, Jews read the whole Torah, end to end, over 52 weeks. Bible study groups do the same, Christian Bible study groups, or Jewish ones, do the same thing. And they'll usually read a chapter, maybe two, maybe one story, like we read Noah, like 3 chapters, 4. But they read short bits at a time. Okay. Biblical scholars who adhere to the documentary hypothesis, working within the tradition of, or the framework of biblical scholarship, of biblical criticism, have exacerbated this. So this is the way Jews and Christians have been reading the Bible for a very long time, bit by bit by bit. And biblical criticism has encouraged readers and scholars has made it worse, or has made this more pronounced, by encouraging readers and scholars to ingest the Torah as a patchwork of separate literary small bits, of separate contributions by different authors reflecting different national purposes or religious purposes or political purposes, representing different religious traditions, different religious sensibilities. Okay? So these biblical scholars, of biblical criticism, have therefore actively and purposefully discouraged readers from ingesting the stories of the Torah as one literary whole. Okay? They encourage the fragmentation of the text, and this is referred to as this phenomenon of breaking up the text into small bits, or even smaller fragments. This development is referred to as the eclipse of biblical narrative. Okay? It's an approach to the Bible in which the reader dips into the text here and there for this or that bit of storyline. Okay? It's not exclusively a product of biblical scholars or biblical criticism, or of clerics, or of devotional readers, but they all use this method to read the Bible. Most of us, most people who read the Bible, this is how they read it. Again, in bits and pieces here and there. So we use this method to read the Bible, some for pragmatic reasons, since people don't have the time, the ability to sit and read large texts at one sitting, and some do this for religious or devotional purposes, and some because of scholarly conviction. And by this I mean the scholars of biblical criticism. And this way of reading the Bible in fragments has certain benefits, pragmatic and other, but it necessarily prevents readers from being able to see the subtle literary methods that this ancient author or this ancient narrative, uses to weave strands of the story together and to highlight certain themes and to make connections or to make critiques or to identify differences between one part of the story and a parallel story. Okay? And this method, because of this, it necessarily prevents us from experiencing the biblical text the way its original audiences experienced it. Okay? We read it with our eyes in fragments, whereas they, back then, heard it as one long-form oration, like a holistic presentation of the entire literary unit. Now, modern literary scholars routinely marvel at the amount of text that pre-literate people could retain and recite from memory. Okay? Modern society's high rates of literacy have made this skill less useful. You don't need to memorize and recite because you have the text and everybody knows how to read. And because this, readers have lost this ability to memorize and recite. By the same token, though, authors write differently to a literate audience of readers than they did to an illiterate audience of listeners. Okay? Works written for illiterate audiences, works like the Bible, were written for the human ear, not the human eye. Now, Borgman cites a Chinese proverb about narrative to explain how ancient texts were written, read, and heard. And this proverb says that, "Tell me, and I will forget. Show me, and I will remember. Involve me, and I will understand." Okay? The Torah has no narrator character to point out things to the audience. Okay? To tell the audience, this character felt like this, or these were actually his inner thoughts, or have the narrator tell the reader, note the difference between A's reactions and B's reactions. Okay? Instead, the narrative itself calls the audience's attention to clues and messages regarding the character's thoughts and fears and desires and inner conflicts. Okay? Like other ancient narratives, the Bible uses literary devices to do this. Okay? So it doesn't have a narrator who will direct your attention to it. Instead, it has literary devices. Okay? Repetition is one such literary device. Okay? If you miss the repetition, you miss the message that the author inserted there for us. And a reader who reads the Bible in that fragmentary way that most modern Jews and Christians read the Bible is bound to miss the repetition in the text. Okay? Because, again, you're reading one chapter this week, and you're going to read the next chapter a week from now. You're not going to remember kind of repeating motifs, repeating words or phrases, etc. A scholar who reads the Bible in the fragmentary way that the documentary hypothesis recommends will see repetition not as an author's literary device to involve and guide the audience, but as evidence of clumsy editorship. Yeah. Another literary device is genealogy, which we discussed with regard to the Noah story, okay, and the Abraham story. Okay. The Bible is full of genealogies, and we all tend to skip over them because they're boring. Okay. A begat B, begat C, begat D, begat, etc. Okay. But they're in there for, look, the Bible is very sparse. Okay. So if there's a genealogy there, it's not just filler. Okay? These genealogies have a meaning and a purpose. Okay? If we can't if we cannot see the purpose, it means that we shouldn't just dismiss it as useless and skip over it. Instead, it means we need to remember that there's a lot of competition to get into the Bible. Okay? The Bible is very, like I said, very sparse. So if it's there, it means that the author or the editor or the editors had a purposeful purpose, if that's a word, to insert it in there. Okay? Which means that we shouldn't, if we don't understand why it's there, if it's boring to us, if it's meaningless, it means that we need to stay on it and try harder to understand the author's purpose or editor's purpose. Another literary device that the author uses to convey messages to us is, I don't know what it's called in English. In Hebrew, it's Maaseh Avot Simanei Banim, which translates into what the father does, what fathers do presages what the sons will do. Okay, it's kind of like, I guess the principle is like father, like son. So so you have these stories about forefathers that, again, involve the audience by requiring the audience to connect these stories from different parts of the Torah. Okay? A story about an ancestral father and stories about his progeny. Okay? So instead of reading them as separate stories, you're supposed to connect this story to that, this early story, this origin story, to some story later on about the character or about the descendants of that character. With regard to the Abraham story, when readers read the Bible in fragments, again, as most of us do, in synagogue or church or Bible groups, they see God's interactions with Abraham as separate episodes rather than seeing it as an elaborate build-up in a holistic relationship story. Okay? So Abraham twice allows his wife to be taken by another man. Okay? That's repetition. But the details are slightly different, revealing important changes in God's relationship with Abraham. Okay? Isaac repeats this course of action as well. Again, repetition, designed to highlight something about Isaac compared with Abraham. God visited Abraham 7 times. Again, 7 is a sacred and meaningful number in Judaism. Okay? It suggests that the 7 meetings represent one whole. Okay? So God and Abraham meet 7 times, or converse 7 times. But these meetings are not carbon copies of one another. In each visit, God makes certain demands on Abraham and makes certain promises, okay, which is, again, repetition. The promises are, they seem to be replays of one another. Okay? The subtle differences between these repeated demands from Abraham and repeated promises to Abraham reveal changes in Abraham's character, changes in Abraham's trust in God's wisdom and goodness and ability and concern for Abraham. Okay? Changes in God's trust in Abraham's trust in God, and changes in the nature of the relationship between God and Abraham. So this evolving relationship puts God's last demand, the sacrifice of Isaac, and puts Abraham's response to it in a different light. Okay? People who read just this last interaction between God and Abraham cannot make sense of it, and for good reason. Okay? It does seem arbitrary and cruel, and Abraham seems completely bewildering to us. But those who read the entire story closely, tracking all 7 meetings, can understand God's demand as well as Abraham's acquiescence. Both make more sense and emerge in a more positive in a less monstrous light if you read the whole thing. And this is why you should read the full stories that the Bible narrates to us. Okay? Read multiple chapters at a time rather than one chapter at a time or one bit of a story at a time. Okay? And so that's why we need to read the full 12th chapter, the full Abraham story for next week's discussion on Abraham. So hope you enjoy the reading, and keep an eye or ear out for repetition and differences. For repetition, and within these repeating stories, see if you can identify the differences as well. And I'll see you then. Thanks.